Jag kan snacka lite norsk, men du kan inte förstå mig hvis jag snackar med dig om det. Kan du förstå det? Ha det gott. So why am I wearing a Norwegian flag beanie? And what the heck was I saying when this video opened? Well, in my best possible Norwegian, I was actually talking to you a little bit. I'll tell you about my Norwegian connection from Runner's World. In 1985, I ran the Chicago Marathon, the America's Bank Chicago Marathon. And during the race, as so often happened, I found myself among the lead women runners, including Joan Benoit Samuelson, Ingrid Christensen of Norway, and Rosa Mota of Portugal. Now, I didn't hang on to that group for more than about 6 miles because Joni was on a mission that day and set the women's world record of 2:21. Ingrid was around 2:23, and Rosa Mota not far behind. I was a distant 2:33, not in the women's race anyway, but it wasn't one of my better marathons. But that particular race was special to me because less than a month later at the New York City Marathon, I had breakfast with one Jack Weitz, yes, the husband of Greta Weitz, and Johan Kagestad, who was the coach to both Greta Weitz and Ingrid Christensen, and we started talking in English about Norwegian training and why the Norwegians were having such success in the marathon at that particular time, particularly Ingrid and Greta, but also several male runners, both in smaller races, smaller Houston Marathon and New York City Marathon, New York City, Chicago Marathon, etc. And I really enjoyed his training philosophy. I had a fantastic coach, Bill Squire, so I didn't really need a coach, but I always liked getting training tips and advice from various coaches. I mentioned Jack Daniels of Athletics West before, and Johan and Jack Waits and I became good friends and had a great breakfast conversation. I was actually helping to cover the race, not really for Runner's World, but I was helping with the hospitality suite at the New York Roadrunners Club. The invited athletes would actually be able to come and hang out in this suite that the New York Roadrunners provided, and I met several elite athletes. Greta Weitz, I had met sort of on the run during one of the New York City marathons, but this was a particularly hot year at New York City. I remember that was, I believe, the year. Cut off my own video. I believe that was the year that Orlando Pizzolato came from nowhere and won the New York City Marathon on a hot day. And I continued to stay in touch with Johan Kagestad, the Norwegian coach, and early in late in 1986, in the summer of 1986, I actually bought a ticket and took a trip to Norway. I was invited by Johan to stay with him and his family, and man, oh man, oh man, I actually wanted to honor them by teaching myself Norwegian. Even though Norwegians speak fluent English, I thought it would be nice if I could converse with them in their own language. So I actually bought as many books and tapes as possible and became fairly adept at Norwegian. The little opening phrase that I gave you guys, I basically said I can speak Norwegian, but you can probably not understand me if I speak to you in Norwegian. And I've gotten really rusty over the years, but I used to be able to get along pretty well in Norway, buying groceries and conversing with people. And that was sort of my introduction to Norwegian culture. I flew into Norway and was greeted by one of Johan's runners, and we actually, Roy Anderson was his name, I'm sorry. We went to Roy's house, and the next day, actually, I ran a 10K road race on a quite warm day for Norway and finished top 10 overall in the race. Actually won my my age category somehow. I must have been 25 at the time, 26 or so, and won the particular, maybe it's 25 to 29 division. So that was pretty impressive for an American to come over and take a trophy away from some Norwegians. But man, what a neat race. The Norwegian crowds, even for a small local road race, were quite prolific and large, and they were yelling and encouraging the entire time. And that was my introduction to racing in Norway. So that particular summer, I was introduced to the land of the midnight sun. It never gets dark at that time of year. Johan's house, when I went out to his house in Vikersund, Johan's house had blinds on the windows so people could actually have some darkness in their rooms at night. And I kept my blinds open. I kind of like the glow from the slightly dark but mostly light sky just outside of Oslo, Norway. So that was my first summer. I spent almost 2 weeks in Oslo, in the Oslo area. The next, I guess it was, next summer, I actually went back to Norway and spent 2 more weeks and got a lot more training advice from Johan. He actually gave me some tips on running for time rather than mileage, so I started to incorporate that into my training program, going for a 1 hour run instead of worrying about a 9 or 10 mile run, and doing 2 to 3 hour long runs, taking recovery days of 30 to 40 minute easy runs. And unlike Ingrid, I did not get on a treadmill when the weather was bad in Pennsylvania. I trained in the snow. So that was my introduction to the Norwegians. At the Houston Marathon one year, when a Norwegian lady, Bente Mo, actually won the women's title. This was, I want to say, 1987. It was 1987. I actually took all the Norwegians in attendance out to my mom and dad's house, and we had a nice American meal after the race, and my parents were sort of introduced to the Norwegians and got a kick out of their accents, of course. So imagine West Texas drawl versus beautiful Norwegian flowing language. That was quite the dinner with my friends and my family. So that was Norway. Now, I kept in touch with Johan over the next several years, and actually ran into him when I was coaching my 2 Olympic athletes, who I'll talk about many episodes hence. And the Bislett Games was a huge event, still is a huge event on the European circuit, and I ran into Johan. This time I was in the role of a coach and no longer in the role of an athlete. Oh, an interesting thing too, that was one of 2 of the 3 times in my life I've ever run on a treadmill were during that second trip to Norway. I stayed one night with Ingrid Christensen, her husband and son, and she was famous for running on her treadmill in her basement. So I decided to check out the treadmill. Plus, I had a max VO2 test the following day with her team physician. He was going to test my max VO2, put me through the stress test with the face mask, etc. Measures your lung volume and your fast twitch, slow twitch muscle fibers. I was going through the entire lab procedure, so I wanted to at least become familiar with running on a treadmill since I never did it. I ran 30 minutes on her treadmill in the basement and did not enjoy it at all. I just didn't feel comfortable on the treadmill. The next day at the max VO2 test, once again, I'm hooked up to all kinds of tubes and masks and put through the ringer and ran on a treadmill to exhaustion. They kept increasing the grade, of course, if you've ever done a max VO2 test, and all the particulars. Some of the numbers are gone, but it was a quite high max VO2. Believe it or not, my max VO2 was in the 80s, which was quite high. My limiting factor, according to the muscle biopsy, was my very high percentage of slow twitch fibers and low percentage of fast twitch fibers. So my ability to become a world-class marathoner were not, my ability to do so was not really in the cards. So he predicted that at very best I might someday run a sub 220, maybe even a 217, 218. At the time, I was a 223 marathoner, so I'd gotten quite a lot out of the body I was blessed with, and I was blessed with a huge engine. There again, the high max VO2, the ability to utilize oxygen. I could run at near my max for an extended period of time, but I didn't have the leg turnover required to be one of those world-class 210, 215. Now it's like 203, 205 marathoners. So anyway, that particular trip to Norway gave me a lot of insight into training for someone with those types of numbers on a max VO2 test and that type of a ratio of fast twitch, slow twitch. Wonderful times in Norway. I fell in love with Oslo the first time in '86 and even more so in the summer of '87. And I would love to go back there, even in the wintertime. I love snow, so why not go in the wintertime? They are famous for their winter sports, and this particular Olympics, they had the most overall medals of any country. Tiny little Norway. Wonderful food, wonderful people, beautiful language. That is my experience with the Norwegians and their culture. Har det godt.